It always starts with something so impossibly small, something so mundane that you barely even register the insidious nature of it until it's already too late, until the quiet sanctuary you've built for your family is slowly being suffocated by the suffocating grip of neighborhood bureaucracy. And for us, residing in the meticulously manicured, aggressively pleasant subdivisions of Naperville, Illinois, it began with a piece of stationery, a brightly colored, obnoxiously neon pink sticky note, slapped against the frosted glass of our front door, its cheerful hue violently clashing with the venomous, thick black sharpness scrawled across it, demanding that we be considerate of our neighbors because the excessive dog barking is a disruptive nuisance. A claim that made me furrow my brow and peel the offending paper away with a confused scoff, glancing down at Duke, our aging, chronically lazy golden retriever who was currently sprawled out in a patch of afternoon sunlight on the living room rug, snoring with the kind of peaceful innocence that only a dog possesses. He might have let out a half-hearted woof at a particularly brazen squirrel earlier that afternoon, just standard, harmless canine behavior that echoes through any cul-de-sac in America. So I crumpled the note into a tight ball and tossed it into the trash, writing it off as the ramblings of someone with far too much time and far too little joy, because this was suburbia, the supposed American dream, where the occasional dog bark over a cedar fence was just part of the ambient soundtrack. But the notes didn't stop. They multiplied, appearing every few days like a plague of passive-aggressive locusts, escalating in both their alarming frequency and their thinly veiled threats, lecturing me about undue stress and demanding that I rectify the situation immediately, or perhaps look into behavioral correction facilities, each one signed with a sickeningly sweet flourish that read sincerely, Brenda, 42, Elmwood Court. Brenda. The very name began to conjure a visceral image in my mind of rigid posture, perfectly shellacked hair that never moved in the wind, a pastel cardigan draped over her shoulders like a cape of moral superiority, and a perpetually tight-lipped frown of absolute disapproval, a woman I had only ever seen in fleeting, passing glances, usually hunched over her impeccably pruned hydrangeas, casting a gaze of absolute, unfiltered disdain toward my slightly overgrown fescue grass, her eyes scanning for any infraction of the unwritten rules of the neighborhood. At first, I genuinely tried to be the bigger person, feeling a protective instinct over my family's peace. I went to the pet store and dropped $50 on new, heavy-duty chew toys to keep Duke occupied. I spent extra time in the yard running through basic commands, hoping to appease the invisible watcher next door. But Brenda, it seemed, was operating on a frequency far beyond human hearing, possessing a supernatural, almost predatory ability to detect even the faintest shifting of paws or a muffled yawn from inside my walls, and soon, the pink sticky notes were replaced by something far more sinister, official, watermarked envelopes from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, filled with sternly worded citations, boxes aggressively checked off for disturbing the peace and violating community noise ordinances, accompanied by a log of timestamps that defied all logical explanation. 2:17 a.m., 5:48 a.m., 11:32 p.m., hours when the house was dead silent, hours when Duke was invariably curled into a tight, warm ball at the foot of my bed, deep in sleep. Then, the psychological warfare escalated from paper to uniforms, marked patrol cars rolling slowly down our quiet street, their headlights sweeping across the front lawn before coming to a stop, and it was usually Officer Higgins, a kind-faced, visibly exhausted veteran of the local precinct with a weary slump to his shoulders, who would stand on my porch looking genuinely apologetic, holding his clipboard and sighing heavily as he told me, "Sorry to bother you folks again, but we got another noise complaint from down the street," his eyes dropping to look at Duke, who would usually be lying on his back, waiting for belly rubs with blissful, oblivious indifference. "Seems pretty quiet to me," Officer Higgins would murmur, a ghost of a sympathetic smile playing on his lips, and I would stand there, the cool night air biting at my arms, exhaustively explaining the campaign of terror, the impossible timestamps, the sheer physical impossibility of the accusations, and he would nod, understanding the unspoken reality of suburban neighborhood disputes, promising to go have a word with the complainant, acknowledging that sometimes people just get a little overzealous with their perceived authority. But the visits didn't stop. They became a dark rhythm to our lives, a recurring nightmare that shattered our evenings. And with every subsequent call, Officer Higgins seemed more trapped by protocol, his apologetic demeanor giving way to bureaucratic necessity, until one particularly freezing Tuesday night, he stood under my porch light and admitted, his voice tight, that Brenda was now escalating her claims, insisting that her sleep was being violently disrupted, and she had even gone so far as to provide evidence, holding up his phone to play a grainy, staticky, utterly distorted audio file of what sounded like a pack of wild coyotes howling through a tin can, an audio clip that was so clearly manipulated, its volume artificially boosted, captured with some sort of parabolic microphone pointed directly at my property, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brenda was no longer just a hypersensitive neighbor. She was a predator, actively fabricating evidence to build a fraudulent case against my family. The absolute final straw, the moment the fragile social contract of our neighborhood was permanently incinerated, arrived at 3 a.m. on a Thursday, when the violent, relentless buzzing of our doorbell tore through the heavy silence of the house like a physical blow, making me groan and fumble blindly for my glasses in the pitch black, my heart hammering violently against my ribs in a cocktail of profound confusion and sudden, icy dread, while beside me, my wife, Chloe, jolted awake, her voice thick with sleep and laced with panic as she asked what was happening, to which I could only mutter a dark curse under my breath, already knowing exactly whose phantom hand was orchestrating this madness. Stumbling down the hallway, the insistent, aggressive pounding on the thick wood of the front door echoed up the stairs, followed by a sharp, authoritative voice demanding that I open up. And this wasn't the gentle, resigned knock of Officer Higgins. This was the hard, unyielding demand of officers who believed they were walking into a hostile situation, making my blood run ice cold as I practically flew down the stairs, Chloe right behind me clutching her robe, her face pale and etched with deep, terrifying worry. Looking through the peephole, I saw two unfamiliar, stern-faced officers, their postures rigid, their hands hovering near their belts, and as I threw the deadbolt back and pulled the door open, the taller of the two immediately stepped forward, his voice clipping through the night air, demanding to know what was going on, stating they were responding to a high-priority, repeated disturbance of the peace, that a neighbor was terrified by the incessant, aggressive animal noises coming from my residence. I looked back at Chloe, who was now kneeling on the hardwood floor, wrapping her arms around a very groggy, heavily blinking Duke, who hadn't made a single sound all night, and I felt a hot, blinding wave of absolute, unadulterated fury rise in my chest, my voice tight and trembling with suppressed rage as I looked those officers dead in the eye and told them that my dog had been asleep for 6 hours, that this was a targeted, malicious campaign of harassment, that they were being used as pawns by a woman who was weaponizing the police against my family. But the officers, caught in the suffocating web of mandatory response protocols, simply looked uncomfortable, reciting their rehearsed platitudes, suggesting I find a way to resolve this amicably before they were forced to issue a citation, before finally backing away into the dark, leaving me standing in the doorway, my hands clenched into white-knuckled fists, my body shaking with an anger so profound, so deeply rooted in the primal instinct to protect my home, that as Chloe touched my shoulder to guide me back to bed, I knew sleep was a ghost I wouldn't catch, because as I lay staring at the ceiling, the anger crystallized into a cold, hard, unshakable determination, realizing this was no longer just a neighborhood nuisance. This was an unprovoked war, and I was going to fight back. Sleep completely eluded me that night, my mind racing through the dark hours, plagued by the flashing mental image of Brenda's face, contorted with that toxic, self-righteous indignation, standing safely behind her curtains while armed men showed up at my door to terrorize my wife and my dog. And the sheer, staggering injustice of it all gnawed at the very marrow of my bones, making me toss and turn in the tangled sheets as I mentally discarded every conventional option. Talking to her was like trying to reason with a brick wall. Complaining to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association was less than useless since they only cared about the exact height of the sidewalk edging. So I needed something entirely different, something completely unconventional, a response that stepped outside the bounds of polite society, and as a flicker of dark, dangerous humor sparked in the blackness of our bedroom, I realized that if Brenda wanted to play psychological games to see who would break first, I could play them too. Only I was an engineer with a lot of spare hardware, and I was going to play for keeps. I sat bolt upright, a wild, almost manic grin stretching across my tired face, and I gently nudged Chloe, whispering into the quiet room that I had an idea, a vision for a highly personalized deterrent, something beautifully specific, a system designed with the sole purpose of identifying and repelling one specific entity. And by the time the sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dewy lawns of Naperville, I was heavily caffeinated and locked inside my garage, my sanctuary of tools, loose wires, and half-finished projects, where my background in systems engineering was about to be weaponized in the pettiest, most glorious way imaginable. I dragged out an older, repurposed secondary PC rig I had sitting in the corner, a sturdy, reliable machine running an Intel i5-9400 CPU and a GTX 1660T GPU, perfect for handling the intensive, real-time data processing required for what I was about to build, and I booted it up, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard as I began diving deep into the world of open-source computer vision, biometric tracking algorithms, and unconventional, high-decibel auditory deterrents. This couldn't just be a simple, dumb motion sensor that would blast the mailman or a stray cat. No, this Brenda repellent needed to be a masterpiece of targeting, a sophisticated network meticulously trained on her specific, horrible essence. So I fed the system hours of security footage I had of her lurking near the property line, utilizing the GPU to train the facial recognition software on her perpetually disapproving visage, logging the exact geometry of her frown. But I went further. I went into the realm of absolute obsession, programming a secondary layer of gait analysis, studying the aggressive, highly distinctive power walk she used, the stiff swinging of her arms, the precise, entitled angle of her stride, ensuring the system could identify her from 100 yards away, calculating her approach vector with terrifying accuracy. But detection was only half the battle. The response had to be theatrical. It had to be something that would shatter her false sense of authority, something loud, obnoxious, and dripping with irony. And the answer was a series of custom-modified, high-pressure air horns, not just standard boat horns, but devices I tweaked to emit a slightly higher, piercing, almost panic-inducing shriek. Paired with a custom audio track, I recorded myself, spending hours at my desk refining the voice modulation, adding a smooth, robotic, overly polite tone reminiscent of an automated public service announcement, mixed with a subtle, echoing reverb that would boom across the yard. Attention. Brenda detected. Warning. Excessive complaining in progress. Please proceed with caution. A message so dripping with passive-aggressive venom it felt like a work of art. The installation took days, transforming my front yard into a heavily fortified, invisible defensive perimeter, where the air horns were buried deep inside the decorative shrubs, disguised seamlessly as solar garden lights, their wiring snaking beneath the mulch like the metallic roots of a vengeful tree, all feeding back to the PC rig in the garage, while the network of cameras, hidden inside hollowed-out birdhouses and mounted under the eaves, kept a constant, unblinking watch over the property line, communicating with the core processor in real time. Testing it was a hilarious, nerve-wracking process of calibrating the neural net, forcing me to walk up my own driveway holding a life-sized, printed cardboard cutout of Brenda's face taped to a broomstick, ducking as the air horns erupted and the robotic voice echoed off the siding, while Duke sat on the porch, tilting his head with profound canine confusion, until finally, after tweaking the sensitivity and refining the algorithms, the system was armed, a silent, waiting trap, a cinematic confrontation just begging to be triggered, and all I had to do was sit on my porch with a cold glass of iced tea, watching the edge of my lawn, waiting for the villain to step onto the stage. And of course, she couldn't resist. She simply couldn't help herself, because drawn by the magnetic pull of her own hubris and my deliberately untrimmed rose bushes, she marched out of her house on a Tuesday afternoon, a tiny, brightly colored property flag clutched in her fist, her face a thundercloud of righteous fury, stepping perfectly into the frame of my invisible camera network like the subject of a dramatic, high-contrast YouTube thumbnail, the shadows harsh against her face, the tension thick in the suburban air, and the absolute second her sensibly shod foot crossed the invisible threshold of my property line, the GTX 1660T in the garage processed her face, verified her gait, and sent the kill signal. Whoosh. The first air horn screamed from the hydrangeas, a deafening, localized blast that made Brenda freeze, her head snapping around in sheer terror as if the plants themselves were screaming at her, her perfectly coiffed hair catching the wind as the smooth, mocking voice boomed from the hidden outdoor speakers. Attention. Brenda detected. Warning. Excessive complaining in progress. And I watched, practically vibrating with glee, as her expression shattered from arrogant authority into pure, unadulterated shock, her eyes darting frantically across the empty yard, before she angrily set her jaw and took another defiant step forward, trying to plant her little flag in my grass, which instantly triggered the second proximity zone, unleashing a relentless, overlapping barrage of air horn blasts, whoosh, 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 drowning out her shrieks of indignation, forcing her into a panicked, humiliated retreat, her hands clamped over her ears, stumbling backward down the driveway, her manicured composure completely, utterly destroyed, while I stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, watching her flee with a smile so wide it hurt my cheeks, knowing the war had just shifted in my favor. Of course, a predator doesn't just slink away into the night after being embarrassed, they double down, and Brenda, fueled by a humiliation she had never before experienced in her decades of neighborhood tyranny, launched an all-out administrative nuclear strike, sending a massively dramatized, multi-page, formally typed manifesto to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, claiming severe emotional distress, terroristic threats, and a blatant disregard for community harmony, demanding my immediate expulsion or heavy fines, effectively forcing the hand of the board to call a special, mandatory hearing, an event I had been anticipating, preparing for it not with a defensive posture, but with an arsenal of digital evidence. The meeting was held in the stuffy, wood-paneled community center, presided over by Arthur Sterling, a retired accountant whose lifeblood was bylaws and regulations, flanked by Eleanor Vance, a no-nonsense retired teacher, and Marcus Cole, a younger resident who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. All of them staring at me with a mixture of exhaustion and annoyance as Brenda sat across the aisle, radiating smug, vindictive triumph, fully believing she had cornered her prey. But when it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't get angry, I simply stood up, hooked my laptop into the projector, and spoke with the calm, measured tone of a man who knows he's already won, explaining that due to a string of severe security concerns and targeted harassment at my property during late-night hours, I was forced to install a proprietary, AI-driven security system to protect my family and my dog. I hit play, and the projector illuminated the room with the raw, undeniable truth, but I started with the carefully curated highlight reel. Crisp, high-definition footage of Brenda creeping along my fence line at dusk, binoculars pressed to her face, peering into my living room windows, sneaking onto my driveway at 4 a.m. to deliberately rattle the gate to agitate Duke, and even a clip of her attempting to bash one of my hidden cameras with a heavy garden gnome, her face twisted in malice, and the silence in the room was absolute, deafening, heavy with the collective realization of the board members who were watching their supposedly upstanding neighbor act like a deranged stalker, their mouths slightly open, as the cinematic reality of her obsession played out in 1080p, and when Brenda leapt from her chair, her face flushed a dark, violent purple, screaming that the footage was taken out of context, that she was just checking the property lines, I simply smiled, a cold, surgical smile, and asked her exactly what context justifies prowling in the bushes at 4 in the morning. The board was stunned, the power dynamic in the room shifting so rapidly you could feel the air pressure change. And when Eleanor Vance, trying to suppress a smirk, asked to see the footage of the noise deterrent in action, I happily obliged, playing the unedited clips of Brenda triggering the air horns, her theatrical, exaggerated flinching, her furious stomping away, and the room, despite its formal setting, erupted into stifled laughter, Even Marcus Cole couldn't hide his grin because the sheer, petty genius of the system, combined with the irrefutable evidence of her psychotic behavior, completely dissolved her carefully constructed narrative of victimhood. The verdict from the HOA was swift, decisive, and beautifully humiliating for her. Brenda was issued a severe, formal warning, hand-delivered by a very stern Arthur Sterling, detailing her unwarranted intrusions, her fabricated noise complaints, and threatening severe legal and financial repercussions if she ever stepped foot near my property again, officially ending her reign of terror, stripping her of her power, and turning her from the feared neighborhood enforcer into the ultimate punchline. But I didn't stop there, because justice is one thing, but establishing a legacy is another. So I took the footage, anonymized the faces just enough to avoid a lawsuit, but keeping the spirit of the conflict intact, and uploaded it online, where the concept of the custom, AI-driven neighbor repellent exploded, going completely, uncontrollably viral, transforming my little garage project into a symbol of resistance for anyone who had ever been bullied in their own home, my inbox flooding with desperate requests from people begging to buy their own system, turning a petty revenge tactic into a potential tech startup, all while Brenda retreated into the dark interior of her house, her reputation shattered, her authority evaporated, a prisoner of her own making in the neighborhood she once tried to rule. And as I sat on my porch weeks later, watching the sun set over the quiet streets, Duke sleeping peacefully at my feet, the silence finally, truly unbroken, it left me wondering about the nature of modern conflict and the lengths we go to in order to protect our peace. Because while my methods were undoubtedly extreme, arguably petty, and heavily reliant on psychological warfare, it forces the question, when the systems designed to protect us, the police, the community boards, the social contracts, are weaponized by those with malicious intent, is it not our moral imperative to build our own defenses, to use whatever technology we have to fight back? Or does descending into the mud to defeat a monster simply make us a different kind of monster altogether?
Alright, and that is for today's videos. I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe and share it with your friends. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.